Welcome to the GEC Podcast, a ministry of Grace Episcopal Church, Sheboygan, Wisconsin. For more information and a schedule of our services, please visit gracesheboygan.com.
This is Deacon Michelle Whitford. I am here with Sister Barbara Jean. If you would introduce yourself, that would be terrific.
Hello, Michelle. I am, as she said, Sister Barbara Jean. Everyone calls me Sister BJ. I'm one of the co-founders of the Anamchara Fellowship, which is part of the new monasticism, an expression of monastic orders within the Episcopal Church. We were established in 2003, so we're not completely new, and we have continued to grow into what we are or what we are becoming in terms of monasticism, in terms of what it means to be a Celtic monastic community within the church.
Talk about Celtic spirituality. It goes way back before Christianity. What is that about?
I think the first question that most people would want to know is what is a Celt? Where do the Celts come from? They were originally an Indo-European confederation of tribes. Most people don't realize, who are Christians who read the Bible, don't realize that there is a letter to the Celts from St. Paul. It's his letter to the Galatians. And you find as they migrated from kind of Eastern European area, they migrated west and kept being pushed to the west. There was a group that ended up in Gaul, so you have Galatians. There was a group that ended up down in the Iberian Peninsula of Spain area, and then they kept being pushed west until the Celts that we tend to know about today are the ones that reside in Ireland, Scotland, Wales, Cornwall. And they kind of couldn't go any further than that because the water stopped them, though there is some speculation that they actually discovered America way before Columbus ever got here. But so this goes way, way back, and these are peoples who are made up of tribal languages. There's two dominant languages that they fall under, either a Brythonic or a Gaelic language. We know the Gaelic languages as being Irish or Scottish, but that's different from the languages that are spoken in Wales, the Isle of Man, and Breton in France, and those are the Brythonic languages. And we probably have heard of Druids somewhere along the line of the religious leaders of these Celtic peoples. Well, the Druids were really the intelligentsia. They were not just the priests, but they were also the doctors, the lawyers, and there were different classes of Druids. And one of the classes of Druids were the Bards. They were the ones who told the stories about the people themselves. And this was a very important group of folk because they kept the tradition of the tribe ever at the forefront. So this group of people that gets pushed to the west established their communities of family groups in these small areas of Ireland, of Scotland, of the islands all around there. And they were close-knit groups. They fought with each other for dominance and that sort of thing. And they had their own religious traditions and very, very, very nature-centered. So what we would recognize as their primal religious beliefs can be mirrored very much in our Native American tribes, the spiritualities. When you can put them side by side, it's almost like, wow, did they really know each other? Because of the way they treated creation, dealt with creation, revered creation. We think of them kind of in jest as being tree huggers. Because, they worship trees, they worship the oak or whatever. But they saw that God created everything, and therefore God is within all of creation, within the stones, within the trees, within the storm, the violent storms that came to and fro, bashed them about with their gale winds and all of that sort of thing. And so God saw God within all of nature, and dealt with. And it wasn't so much that there were all of these gods, but the God concept of God within and manifesting God's self through all of these various bits and pieces of nature and within the tribe itself.
Are these the same people who did Stonehenge and those kind of monolithic places in the British Isles?
Some archaeologists actually think that those Stonehenge-type places, or the Callanish Stones on the Isle of Lewis, or up in the Orkney Isles, were actually pre-Celtic. That there was a people there already by the time the Celts got there. So they weren't really the great stone movers, so to speak. Now, they're related to those because, they moved into those areas and lived around those areas, and they too set up stone monuments that have come. It's interesting that even pre-Christian, you find Celtic crosses. The upright beam, the cross piece, and the circle around that cross piece. That was an important symbol for them, and I'm not sure what it meant to them at that time, but it certainly got translated into a Christian understanding of the Christ figure, the relationship between God and man, and then the circle of eternity around that. So overlay on top of what was already there. The Callanish Stones, for example, which are about 5,000 years old, older than Stonehenge is what they figure. If you see that from the air, it's a Celtic cross, 5,000 years ago.
And that would be predate Jesus and all of Christianity.
All of Christianity. And so it's interesting to me to contemplate what was going on and how was that then adopted into what later became Celtic Christianity.
So let's go there. How did it go from being Celtic spirituality to Celtic Christianity?
One of the things that I love most about this aspect and this question in particular is because we tend to have a history where Christianity moves into a new culture and overrides it and throws out all of the tradition that's gone before as all of that is wrong. And we see that if you read Michener's book Hawaii, how the missionaries went to Hawaii and they tossed out all of the native religion and spirituality as being wrong, and then superimposed their own traditional Christian beliefs on top of that. What happened in Celtic Christianity is that, well, we see St. Patrick is one of the primary examples of Christianity coming into a pagan society and teaching the gospel truths. But Patrick didn't say what you believe is wrong. Instead, he said, yes, this is life as you've known it all these years, and here is this Christ who is the reason behind it all. So he picks up the legend is anyway that he picks up the shamrock with the 3 leaves and explains the Trinity. And what's important about that is that they already had a concept of Trinity, not so much as the persons of God, but that's how they taught. And how you became a Druid was it was all an oral tradition. It took 20 years to get where you wanted to be in whatever particular order of Druid you were striving for, and it was all an oral tradition. And they taught in triads. And so when Patrick comes in with God as 3 and 1, they're like, oh, we get that. So Christianity does in no way says what you believe is wrong. And they take the sacred wells, the sacred trees, and Christianity comes in and doesn't say you can't worship that tree anymore. You can't worship at that well. They come in and say, yes, God creates this, and miracles happen here because of the benefice of the grace, the fecundity of God wells up and produces miracles from this place. And then you have the legends of the various saints of Bridget and Finan and some of these other Celtic saints that they kind of say, well, oh yeah, this guy was here at some point and put his mark on it, and so now it becomes a Christian well instead of a pagan well. It's a different way of looking at evangelism. It's not saying you're wrong, I'm right, but rather, yes, there is something holy going on here, and let me tell you about the God who does that. Mm-hmm.
So truly lays on top of and incorporates into rather than throw the baby out with the bathwater.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And so what I see as I've traveled around these places, around Ireland, around Scotland, what I see are the great evangelists of the time, the saints of the time, who put their mark on those places. The Holy Isle of Iona in Scotland, for example, and it's revered because of Saint Columba. Well, there were Druids living on that island ahead of Columba. And when he comes, he establishes his monastery. And it's sort of like the pagan druidical atmosphere is there, so the spirituality is there. That is already a holy place. But then Columba comes in and sort of baptizes it, in a sense, for Christ. And
the new creation?
Yeah. And it's still a holy place, and you can feel it there. There's a sense of the holiness of place, which people in this country can maybe liken to some places in our southwest desert, the Sedona area, and say, "Ooh, that's what would you call it?" Gosh, I can't think of the name now of sort of a non-Christian sense of the spirituality of places like the mountains and the deserts and the seashore. But we can go there because we bring Christ with us. We can stand in those holy places and claim that for Christ. And it becomes a Christian place. Because we can put up our churches, our crosses, or whatever to establish our sensibilities. But God doesn't need us to do that. To make a place
it's
holy.
All those places where people have gathered in community for ages and ages become holy and sacred places.
Yeah. Absolutely. The teachings of Christ, the good news that is brought to the peoples of these lands, goes back way far. It's like the 5th century and the 6th century, which is a lot further back than most of us even can conceive. We think of going back to the 15th or 14th or 12th century, and we think that's really, really old. Yeah. But let's go back a lot further than that to times when the early church is still in its formative stage. The great councils of the church are still being talked about, discussed. The whole nature of God is still being kind of defined. Yeah. What do we really believe about God? And how does that work? Well, in those days, it was, we have the benefit of history to say, well, this is what the church has taught about X, Y, and Z. Back in those days, it was still so brand new that there was not a template to go by. I'm not sure that they knew of the creeds, even. We know that the creeds came from the 3rd century and 4th century. But that's in the Mediterranean area. What do you do when you're way out on the edge of what they consider the edge of the world? Edge of the world, truly, yeah. And by this time, too, just historically speaking, Rome has been removed. Caesar and all of that, and Hadrian, those great generals that went and conquered the British Isles, they left because they're the 5th century, it's 410, I think it was, that when Rome falls apart. And so all of those soldiers that had been on the British Isles, and by the way, they never really got over to Ireland all that much. They kind of stopped in England. But anyway, they're withdrawn. And so these islands are sort of left to develop on their own without benefit of what was going on the continent. And then later on, when the Pope, I think it was one of the Gregories, sent Augustine of Canterbury to come back to England and establish the church, he didn't come to a place where there were no Christians. There were bishops. There were Christians. The Christian church was there in the Celtic form, and they met and argued a lot about how to do things. When do we celebrate Easter? How do we set up the governance of our traditions? Now, Rome comes, and the Roman, and I don't mean Roman Catholic at this point, I really mean Roman in the terms of the empire and the culture. They have the way they set up their hierarchy of order. Real politics. It's very much so, and diocesan. So you have a location with a bishop over you and the jurisdiction around that. The Celts didn't know anything about that. The way they set up their order is that a monastery would form, and the abbot, who was called up from amongst the people, amongst the monks, and in Celtic Christianity, monks could be married, so there could be family, because they were tribes. They were more a tribe of people rather than an aggregate of units that come together because they have farms there or something. So it's a kind of family unit, and so the abbot becomes then the lead, the head of the familia, and people gather around that, and you might. A bishop may come, or a bishop may be raised up and ordained, but the bishop doesn't have the jurisdiction. The abbot does.
Yeah. So the abbot really acts as the bishop as we know it.
Sort of, but even more so because the abbot is more like a father figure than an administrative figure. And in some places, and you get this a lot in Ireland, particularly in the early days, the abbot becomes more like a monarch or a minor king. In a way. And actually, there were groups of the peoples, the tribes in Ireland that had a king, and the kings were minor kings, and then there was the high king of Tara, who was over them. The abbot in that group of people had, I would say, more respect. People paid more attention to what the abbot was about and was saying than even the king. The king was usually subject to the abbot.
Wow, that's a lot of
power.
Yeah.
It's a very different system, a different way of looking at that, and the way evangelism happened is very different in the Celtic tradition as opposed to what I call the Roman tradition or the Mediterranean model. In the Mediterranean model, you had evangelists that would go out and spread the good news and say, this is the way you're supposed to do things. This is how the church functions. This is what you're supposed to believe. And the Celtic model was we go and establish a monastery, a place to live, and we set up housekeeping. And people become attracted to what they're doing. And they say, come and see. Come live with us. Come pray with us. Come be a part of who we are. Instead of going out and grabbing people and evangelizing them, it was more an embracing them to those others that are out there to come in and just be with us, see how we do things. This is what we believe, and you're welcome to it. It's a very different way of presenting the gospel.
So how is that lived out now? Is it lived out now?
Celtic Christianity and Celtic spirituality have become really, really popular in the last probably 20 years or so. There are some authors that have written a lot of things that people are very excited about because it's brought them closer to God in ways that the church hasn't expressed it, hasn't taught it. These are people like John Philip Newell, he's a good friend, and Ian Bradley, and Ray Simpson, and David Adams, and other Celtic. Esther de Waal is one of the women that has written considerably on Celtic Christianity, Celtic spirituality. A.M. Alchin, he's Welsh, and he's big in the Anglican Church. We revere him in the Anglican tradition, and he writes a lot about the church in Wales. And through these folk, people like me read them and think, wow, this is a different way of looking at what I've been taught as simply as a Christian, but also certainly as an Episcopal Christian, an Anglican Christian, to see this tradition that actually is very positive and expansive in the way that it presents God and Christ and Spirit and how to do church. So it has drawn us, and it is being lived out. My own particular community, Anamchara Fellowship, and we're, 13 years old now, we try to live out Celtic monasticism, which is done differently than the Benedictines or the Franciscans or the Dominicans or whatever. A major way is when you come into a Benedictine monastery or convent, you come into a system that is set up in such a way as you have a novitiate, and you come into that class of novices with a novice master or novice mistress over you, and you're taught kind of in a schola form, You're in a school, and that's how I was raised initially in my former community. And in the Celtic tradition, when the newbie comes to knock on the door to say, gee, I'd like to see how you do things, I think I'd like to live with you and to be one of you, they're brought into the community and then assigned to an older, experienced member of the community to be the mentor. In the olden days, literally, that newbie would come in and live in the little beehive hut with, Brother John, say. And that Anamchara, which is the soul friend, was the person who was your confessor, your parent, your best friend, your advisor, the person who would lead you into what it meant to be a monk in that community. And the way Anamchara Fellowship does this, because we are spread all over the country, I am the Anamchara I live in Delaware, and my Anamchari, I guess is what you might call him, lives in Michigan. And so how do I mentor him? Because of the day and age in which we live, we Skype once a month. And I'm leading him through our formation manual and helping him learn what does it mean to be a monk in the world. Because we're not established in a monastery or a convent situation where we live residentially. We live in our own homes, scattered about the country. And so that is another difference between us and what the Mediterranean model would present.
So how is it, if we look back at the abbess and the monasteries that you were speaking of just earlier, how is it related then to how you live separately and yet together as a fellowship spread all over? How do you attract in then?
That's a mystery to me. I'm not sure how it is we have managed to attract folk, because we don't advertise. We're not out there with the flyer saying, Jesus wants you to come join us, or come live with us, because we don't have, we all live in our own places. And there are a lot of people right now who feel drawn to the religious life, which is really giving of themselves above and beyond, Sunday worship and Wednesday Bible study sort of way of doing your Christian duty, your church duty, whatever, but want to give themselves more fully to a life. And it is living a life in us, not just the way you pray, where you pray, and with whom you pray, but a way of giving your life to this. And there are people who are married, who are partnered, who are, parents and grandparents who have jobs that they don't want to leave, but they want to live this fuller life. And so joining Anamchara Fellowship or one of the other types of dispersed communities, like there is the Anglican Order of Preachers is also a dispersed community, but they're Dominicans. And so they have a very different charism than the Celtic. They're not a Celtic community. They're a Dominican community. But when you live separate, you have to stay connected to the wider community. And the way we do that is technologically. We have groups that get together on Skype usually, or one of the other tools that you can use on the internet. And a group comes together on Monday nights to pray Compline together, and they talk amongst themselves about what's going on in their lives, needs for prayer or whatever, and then they end by praying together. Those of us who are senior members within the community do stay in touch with our newbies, our aspirants, and our novices in that teaching mode. Again, if we live near each other, we see each other once a month. At least. That's the criterion, is at least once a month. Or in my case, with my Anamchari, we meet again on Skype, on the computer. And then our other thing is that the whole community comes together once a year. And at this point, we're in our 4th location because we keep growing. And we're now meeting in the Passionist Retreat Center in Detroit because they've got a lot of rooms, and we have a good bit to grow there.
And so you do come together as a community at least once a year.
At least once a year.
To live in community, to live that expression.
Yes. To pray together, to play together, and we do a lot of that, and to have common formation so that everybody's getting the same training. Because, when you're spread so far apart, and I'm teaching my person, and another sister or brother is teaching their person, are we teaching the same stuff? Now, we have a formation manual that everybody gets. Actually, it's in Dropbox online. And so, you got to be a little tech savvy. And so we have that capacity. But usually because we are habited, that means we do wear habits. Our habits are a distinctive color. And so people know who we are when we're walking down the street as monks and nuns. And so people are attracted to us who live close by. And when that happens, we form what we call priory groups. I live in the Whitby Priory Group, which is in Delaware, northern Delaware. And we come together once a month for a common meal, common prayer, common study. Sometimes it's a whole day. Sometimes it's just for an evening. And so we have all of these different priory groups scattered around the United States, and one new priory group on the Isle of Lewis in Scotland.
So as you gather, as you are a community, whether it's through Skype or other electronic devices or in person, how is it particularly Celtic as you come together? How do you express the Celtic part of it?
Largely by the prayers that we pray, which come from ancient sources. The Carmina Gadelica is from Scotland, were a series of different prayers that were gathered by a fellow named Alexander Carmichael back in the 19th century, in the 1800s, that were oral. Remember, the Celtic tradition was an oral tradition for most of its life, and has only, began to be written down, more like in the 17th, 18th century, so much really more recent. And so we use those prayers rather than others. We don't make up our own prayers. We try to pay a lot more attention to living lightly in creation. That's one of our charisms, really. Mm-hmm. We say, well, shouldn't everybody do that? Well, yeah, I think everybody should do that. But that is a major charism of the Celtic tradition, that we really pay attention to using the resources of our world reverently and lightly, and not take advantage or in any way abuse the system of life that we've been graced by God. Some of our people are more say socially minded than others, that really, like, we have one brother who's big into not using anything with GMOs, for example, but rather more organic kinds of things.
So there's a range of how you, in your community, how you express that. Mm-hmm. There's no, this is what you must do or must not.
No.
And I would guess it would be where you live in the country.
Yes.
You would be much more water sensitive if you lived in the Southwest than
absolutely
the Northeast, or right now the Mid-Atlantic states that are inundated with enough water that they don't need.
We look at the broad spectrum of how one lives one's life, and we don't dictate the particulars of how to meet those. As you say, in different parts of the country, you have different values that you hold up higher than others because of the circumstance. Certainly, the sense of nonviolence is a huge factor for us right now in our day and age, of how do we meet this and bring in the sense of Christ's peace where there is no peace, in terms of living more organically for some people who are very sensitive to the ills that have come to us through chemicals and that sort of a thing. And then spiritually speaking, what makes us different from an Augustinian or a Benedictine or a Jesuit sort of spirituality? Again, it's based in the life of the saints and the prayers of those saints that have come from the Celtic lands. So instead of holding up, say, the French saints, so to speak, in the Roman traditions, or the Carmelite tradition, say, where you have Teresa of Lisieux and maybe Elizabeth of the Trinity, who are French, and holding them, so living in a Carmelite way with Teresa of Avila and John of the Cross, and looking at their charisms, their lifestyles, their way of having a relationship with God, which is wonderful. Our focus is more on those saints that have been produced in the Celtic lands and have spoken their understanding and relationship with God that way.
So it's a both and. It's facets of the same jewel.
Yeah.
It's a reflection from that geographic area, really.
Really. And so in some ways you can say it's kind of an ethnic way of expressing your spirituality, your Christianity. If I were Russian, looking at some of the staretsas and the great Russian saints, and that spirituality is very different. It's not that it's better or worse; it's simply different.
Yeah.
Because it is ethnic in its origins, and I could very easily see if my family were from there and I were raised particularly with those sets of values and focus. Praying with icons, for a major example, is very orthodox. That's great. I don't particularly resonate with that personally. Yeah, I resonate with going out and walking around islands and picking up stones. That's who I am. I love islands, and there is a spirituality about islands, and particularly the islands of Scotland and Ireland that draw me to what they call, and I don't know if the Celts coined this term. Actually, I think it was George MacLeod who reestablished the monastery on Iona back in the early 1900s, of talking about a thin place.
Yes.
Where the reality of the God world and the earth world is so thin that you don't know when you're in one or the other.
Yeah. Thin places.
Thin places. Yeah. Where your heart is really drawn, and you feel like, there are times when I'm on those islands that I feel like I am in heaven. I'm no longer on earth. Just because of the way it makes me feel.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Is there anything else you'd like to add?
I can't think of anything off the top of my head.
I thank you so much for your time, for your insight. I hope we can continue this conversation another time. Maybe next time we'll talk about the mystics.
Ooh, I like that.
Yeah.
Mystical language.
Yes. So thank you, Sister Barbara Jean.
You're welcome.
We'll talk soon.
Thank you for listening to the GEC podcast. Please visit gracesheboygan.com, where you can learn more about us, find a schedule of our services, and hear more podcasts.